This week marks 13 years since the conclusion of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. 13 years since the military defeat of the LTTE, marking the end of a bloody civil war that lasted 26 years. Yesterday, the state ceremony for what was titled as War Heroes Commemoration Day was held in Sri Lanka alongside the monument called the War Heroes Monument. Elsewhere in the north and east, commemoration ceremonies were held by the Mullivaikal Memorial to pay respect to those who had lost their lives in the conflict and those who had lost their lives or disappeared during the last stages of the conflict. Meanwhile, poetry was recited in Sinhalese and Tamil languages at the People's Protest site in Galle, where citizens symbolically consumed what's called Mullivaikal Kanji, a mixture of rice, salt and water. This was incidentally what was had by hundreds of civilians in the north and east during the last stages of the conflict. Now, while Sri Lanka struggles in the throes of a catastrophic economic and political crisis, we thought of shifting gears on tonight's edition of the People's Platform to discuss an area that has fallen by the wayside. Today's topic focuses on justice, accountability, and lessons learned from Sri Lanka's conflict 13 years on. Now, my guest tonight has worked as a former UN Under-Secretary General, former UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women. She was the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict and is a former chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission. Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
As a precursor to tonight's discourse and before delving into specifics, I'd like to ask you to broadly share your reflections on where Sri Lanka stands right now in its journey of justice and accountability 13 years on.
First, let me just say something. You know, the young people at Gota Gogama, and they're very concerned about representation, as you know, and when you speak on something so important such as this, they always want to know where are you coming from, which is the voice that is being spoken. So I must say that I'm not speaking for activists or human rights activists, and I'm not that voice. What I can bring to the table is my experience internationally. I've been to every armed conflict zone in the world, except now Ukraine, and of course Sri Lanka, because you can't do your own country when you are in the UN. But I must say that if we look at this question, I think the first thing to do is just first step back and look at what we mean by justice. Now, there's a Swiss center that has been doing research on justice, and it is convinced that everybody is wired for justice, that it's innate quality, that there's a will to justice in every human being. Now, people don't all accept that. Some say it's constructed. But I must say in my work, I have always found that in most places. I've spoken to Bosnian women, both during the tribunal, after the tribunal, 20 years after, and this absolute determination to get people convicted, to get justice they were undeterrable. But at the same time, there are others, perhaps with less grave crimes, who are completely alienated by the formal process of the tribunal and law. They don't like this adversarial way it's done, the cross-examination. For example, when I went to Rwanda, I went to hear the first person give testimony on sexual violence and conflict, and she spoke, and at the end of it, when I went to see her, she was in absolute tears, because while she was giving this testimony, the perpetrator was using his hands to show her, to threaten her. So people prefer, to some extent, something that is more transformative, that heals the community, especially if the perpetrator lives in the community. Women tend to prefer a justice mechanism that heals. So you have this notion of transformative justice and truth commissions for lesser crimes, where people tell their stories and they heal together. So that's the second thing, the community level. And the third is as deterrence. When I was a young student, I used to write many articles saying punishment never deters, because that was what people... But as Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, I've seen how the ICC making child soldiers a crime. Whenever I went and spoke to warlords or to people in various parts of the world who were having child soldiers, the first question everyone would ask is, how does this ICC provision affect us, and what do we do to get out of it? So there is a deterrence quality. And research also shows that if you go through a justice process, the recurrence, the conflict will not recur. If you don't go through that, it's quick to move back and forth. So now, where is Sri Lanka in all this? So there is now an international template, really, on justice based on the experience of the world. One is to have a tribunal for those who bear the greatest responsibility, if there are war crimes others committed. Then to have a truth commission or something like that for lesser crimes, where the community gets together and tries to heal, but where truth is told and people bring their stories and get vindication, but in a different way, in a different method. Then, of course, there are issues such as missing persons and reparations that Sri Lanka has dealt with as well. And then there's memorialization. The idea that if you memorialize suffering, people will remember and this will not happen again. And the idea really is not to memorialize triumph, but to memorialize suffering. So that, I think, is really important. So Sri Lanka has so far, I think, done missing persons, but not linked to a justice mechanism. It's done reparations, but it has not done any of the others. And it doesn't look like it's going in that direction at all.
Having uncomfortable conversations about Sri Lanka's history. Now, in Germany, teaching the Holocaust is mandatory. It includes visits to concentration camps, to museums. They don't attempt to hide from their own ugly, bitter past. And it ensures that children are empathetic and mature, and it ensures non-recurrence of conflict. But in Sri Lanka, we see a stark difference where children are not taught the past, the history. So how does this tie in with non-recurrence of conflict, which is one of the most important pillars of transitional justice?
Well, I think, the other day I was watching a program in which young journalists, very smart, and the presenter, who was older, said something about 1983 and said, do you know what happened in 1983? And this young singular journalist said, what was that, the JVP uprising? Was that, and none of them really knew what happened in 1983. Meanwhile, if you meet Tamil young people anywhere in the world or in Sri Lanka, 1983 is a defining moment for them. So these two different narratives of history that we have, and beliefs. And now Benedict Anderson, who is this famous researcher, he analyzed all these national anthems and national myths and legends, and he found that what binds people together is common suffering. When you suffer together, you are bonded very much as a nation. And it could be colonialism, it could be like for the Europe religious wars or whatever. So now in Sri Lanka we have two tales of suffering, which are completely unrelated. We have, the central bank bombing, the attacks on the border villages, that whole tale of I am the victim in Sinhalese field, these terrible terrorists. Then we have the Tamil notions of suffering, which is, of course, 1983 riots, state violence, torture, disappearances. And nobody has brought these tales of suffering together. So we have to, if we are going to bond as a nation, we have to look at these things in the face, talk about them, And that is why one of the things recommended by experts that even the previous government took into was a truth commission or something like that, where you will come together and then a report comes out that lays out all that has happened, even to the JVP in the 1989, 1990. So all that is there so that school children know, everybody knows, and history is taught. And it's our history. You know, we must own it. And that's very important, I think, the ugly as well as the, you know, the great kings and the great triumphs.
If we talk about the responsibility of the Sri Lankan state, prior to the 20th Amendment of the Constitution, Article 33(1) said, "It shall be the duty of the President, among other things, to promote national reconciliation and integration." And this clause was repealed by the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. The Sri Lankan state is responsible to ensure and enable the rights protection of all of its people. How must the state go about doing this in a manner in which one section of society doesn't feel victimized or targeted?
Or like a second-class citizen or discrimination. Well, I think, you know, if you look at constitutions, until about 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a march toward democratization and pluralism around the world as well as in Sri Lanka. We pushed for, at one hand, devolution in the pluralist agenda. We pushed for equality at the center. That's the language, you know, Official Languages Act and Tamil as national language. One pushed for that on, very much so. And there was also a movement toward democracy and independent commissions and the whole works. There was a thrust, not only in Sri Lanka, but around the world, these concepts and ideas. But then now constitutional experts see that in the last 10 years there's been a backlash to that. The backlash is to actually say we don't need to make concessions to minorities. We're going to stamp the majorities' ethnicity. We're going to stamp the majorities' religion. We don't want we're going to erase the minorities. This backlash is happening around the world as well as in Sri Lanka. And we don't want democracy. We want strong leaders and authoritarian leaders. Maybe we'll have a little parliament, but basically it'll be strong authority. So there's been a backlash to democratization and pluralism. So I think to some extent we had that phase with the 20th Amendment. And from what I gather, the Ramesh De Silva Commission also was of that view, what I would call the conservative backlash, to erase minorities from Sri Lanka. And I think we have to fight back. And what was wonderful about the people at Gotha Gogama is they have brought it back. They have brought back the national anthem in Tamil, which is strange because the national anthem is in the constitution in Tamil. I remember when we were young, it was sung. It was sung at our independence. Suddenly it disappears. So I think it's important to listen to these young people who have, perhaps they're the post-war generation. They don't have to click to these identities in such an existential threat way. And so they are beginning to see that we need to have these plural identities and democratic ideals back again. I think there's now a backlash to the backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been wonderful to see this resurgence of public consciousness, especially during recent times. And I feel like it's also momentous that we push forward transitional justice, accountability, reconciliation, because we have been given this moment where people, especially young citizens of the Republic, are open to now unlearning toxic behaviors and relearning what they didn't know. Dr. Kumaraswamy, if we take the global perspective, the ubiquity of conflict across the world and the corresponding inability of humanity to not resort back to violence and atrocity, I feel like this is a recurring theme because sometimes you feel we're developed now, as a world we now know better, but then suddenly you have the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So atrocities keep repeating themselves.
Well, I think to some extent the atrocities continue to repeat themselves because basically a rules-based order has never taken hold internationally.
Right.
It has struggled. Now, human rights activists and human rights lawyers take it for granted. Now, there's this rule and it has to be implemented, we have to live it. But a large number of people in the international community, in Sri Lanka, I would say a majority of people even in our foreign ministry, operate on geopolitical realism, right? So that basically power, realism, what you're going to do, who's going to outmaneuver who, how do we, rather than a rules-based system.
Yeah.
You know, this is right, this is wrong, this kind of thing. So, and I think in the last decade or so, with Mr. Trump in the US, with Mr. Putin in Russia and all this, we have accentuated that non-rules-based international system, which does not go to the multilateral forum, which does not listen to multilateral rules. And there is basically now a kind of a realist dealing with each other bilaterally. Things are done bilaterally. And so the system really has nearly become irrelevant unless it's revived again.
Coming back to Sri Lanka, representing Sri Lanka's human rights situation internationally, if we take the UN system, for example, there are resolutions against Sri Lanka, such as the one titled Promoting Reconciliation, Accountability and Human Rights in Sri Lanka. Over the past few years, we've seen the manner in which successive governments have adopted different strategies. The most recent one being a very lackadaisical, unbothered approach of sorts. But if we don't make representations in an honest, transparent manner with the international community, there's a huge vacuum there, right?
Well, I think, I, of course, have been a great critic of Sri Lanka's government's approach to this because I feel that it is based, again, on a purely geopolitical calculation that whatever that human rights is said to be a Western imperialist agenda, and then there'll be a Russia and China and the third world will rise up and protect us, right? This is the framework. But things have changed a lot since the 60s and 70s. First, Latin America has gone through terrible human disappearance. There's a whole history of fighting military dictatorship since the 60s and in the 80s. And they have a very strong human rights orientation. Many of them, Mexico, Chile, for example. Africa, many of them have gone through, South Africa remains more conservative, but others have gone through civil wars, and they also have a much more complicated approach to human rights. And Eastern Europe, which was once, very much, is very much. So now the whole international situation has changed. I feel that unless we are honest, unless the first thing to do is to acknowledge the suffering of people. Whenever these people talk, you would say, look, did anyone die in this war? Is this just a US versus the rest of the world? People have died, people have suffered on all sides. Acknowledge the suffering, acknowledge the grievances. The rest follows. And if you're open and transparent with the international community, you will get Latin America, Africa, everybody in. But if you're trying to just be bombastic, not acknowledge people's suffering, people are much more reticent to come on board. So that is what I feel is wrong with the policy.
But this is the narrative that is also pushed towards the people, especially the majority of the people who vote in leaders or rulers or politicians with these kinds of rhetoric. which is completely flawed and incorrect. And concepts like sovereignty get thrown around very loosely, saying why should we listen to what the international community says? It's the whole concept is oversimplified.
Yeah.
And
where sovereignty is also taking care of your people,
absolutely,
protecting your civilians. Yeah. But also, I just think that there is not enough respect for your own people when you do that. And also, people come around governments because you can rouse people up against the West. I mean, we have probably fought colonialism. Any of us, every Sri Lankan has a seed of anger against the West because of colonialism. So you can just rouse them up on that. But this is a much more Sri Lankan problem. Part of your people have suffered, part of your people have died on all sides. So you have to be genuine, honest, and sincere about how you deal with it.
How do we as a country deal with this concept of intergenerational trauma, which I feel hasn't really been even touched? We have decades and decades of trauma which we have just sort of swept under the rug. As a result of which we have traumatized generations.
Well, I think yes and no. I think intergenerational trauma does take place. You know, psychiatrists have written very extensively after studying the Holocaust, and found for 2-3 generations that trauma lives. You find it sometimes in Sri Lanka as well, in the second generation among the Sinhalese. You find it in the diaspora second generation. Some of the things they're doing in writing, someone was showing me. I saw that there's trauma in that child, you know, even though she has never been in Sri Lanka. And so I think that is something we have, our psychosocial response. And there's also a lot of skepticism about psychosocial work, because people feel we don't need it, we can cope, people stiff upper lip. There's a lot of that discourse also. But we need to plan for that psychosocial issues of one generation, second generation. But the good news is that there are others who, because of what happened, want to transcend it, young people. Who have the trauma but want to transcend it. And I think there is a whole generation which I began meeting really about a year ago. They come to me for various issues and ask questions. Who are that generation? You know, they have not seen the war. They don't want the baggage. They don't want our traumas. They don't want us to infect them with you know, view of the world. You know, they have begun to transcend it. So I think there is hope also.
All right. We are in conversation with Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching The People's Platform. We are in conversation with Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy. Dr. Kumaraswamy, the concept of belonging and identity is one that I'd like your thoughts and views on. We find how a vast number of people, especially the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, second generation Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora across the world, and their lack of connection with Sri Lanka due to obvious reasons, but also we see this gaping gap between the Sri Lankan state and the Sri Lankan identity and them.
Well, the diaspora, Tamil diaspora, is an interesting thing to look at, or any diaspora for that matter, because it's very diverse. You know, it has been made into a monolithic sort of anti-Sri Lankan. There are a lot of people who wish Sri Lanka well, who are very involved in very positive struggles, etc. But there's a generation also that went very angry, especially after 1983. And their children also very angry. And of course, the best way to deal with them is through dialogue. What I found when I was in Geneva is that somehow the response of the earlier government is to sort of set the singular diaspora on the Tamil diaspora. So there were these sessions in Geneva where they would have meetings, where the Tamil diaspora meetings and singular, and there were only them in the room, and they would have a big fight. It was really a formula for a headache. It was just not the way to deal with this issue. You have to begin to talk to the Tamil diaspora. They have a lot to contribute. They can help develop the North, and there has to be a strategy with regard to that. And one part of that strategy is to show both the Tamils and the Muslims that they belong here.
Yeah.
And I think to do that is that you have to include the Tamil national anthem, the symbols of the state first. Now, Nehru had this idea. We were a generation born really with Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi and people who were initially the creators of modern India, that the state would be neutral. It would not at least aspire to be. People argue that they really weren't. But at least the theory was that it would be neutral. And then you'd have the religions and political ideologies, etc. But the state itself would try to be neutral. And therefore everybody is allowed to express themselves, to belong, but they belong in a secular kind of idea of India.
Right.
Now in Sri Lanka, the state has taken sides. It has decided it is singular Buddhist. And the minorities are here at the pleasure or the leisure of the singular Buddhists. So to carve out a conversation, I find very difficult since 2019. That even to begin to broach a topic, to say, look, my family has been here for centuries. I am also one of you. I feel very much a Sri Lankan. I also have come here to, my retirement. I'm planning to live here. I feel very much the earth and everything belongs to me. But to convey that to the Sinhalese and to have a conversation, that has somehow become impossible after 2019. I don't know why. It is a conversation that no longer can be had. And that's sad because the minorities become alienated.
Yeah.
Now what happened again with Gotha Gogama is the conversation began again. And that's why minorities are so supportive of Gotha Gogama, because someone decided to talk about it. Buddhist monks decided to sit at the breaking of fast and all the ceremonies were jointly held. Vesak, the front row was Christian priests and mullahs and even Muslim women seated there, So the conversation was had.
Yeah.
So we have to restart the conversation. We started it at independence. Then it got lost somewhere. We started it in 2015, and it got lost in 2019. And the conversation is to let the minorities into that identity.
When we speak about justice, reconciliation, accountability, we can't depend on the state to be the sole provider and facilitator of this process, right? It should also come outside of the air-conditioned rooms in which constitutions are drafted. It should be sort of also from the bottom up, where people themselves get involved in these processes.
Very much so. It will only last. Ashutosh Vaishni's famous study says that unless you have community level, civil society level links, there will be no interethnic or interreligious harmony. That is the core. What happens in constitutions are not necessary. But what his research showed is that the importance of community level, civil society level interlinking of people. And that is what stops mob violence in Bombay. He did a study in Bombay. Right. If the community speaks to each other, are united, then of course such, they can, like in Negombo, what happened when on May 10th night, when people started raising anti-Muslim slogans and anti-Christian, and there was about to break out. The religious leaders from both communities, Muslim and Christian, went there with civil society leaders. They intervened, and they dissipated it. So it's at the community level that really stops, that creates the peace.
So the responsibility of this Herculean task of sewing back a Sri Lanka that has been sort of broken down by years and years of political strife and conflict. How must this be done now that we are right here in the midst of an economic and political crisis? How must it be done, Doctor?
Well, I think, I know constitutions people think are done in air-conditioned rooms, but they are also a social contract. In the end, the Constitution is the social contract. What is interesting is in India, people read the preamble. When they go on protest marches, they read the preamble of the Constitution as a moral force. So we must have a constitution that every section of society feels represents them. So that's the first task, to have a constitution that is a people's constitution.
Right.
And that can't be drafted by committees and as alone. It has to be drafted in consultation with people around the country, but also maybe in a National Assembly kind of situation, a constituent assembly. And I think that there will be the main, from what I gather, most of the chapters were agreed to when it came to the Constitution. The Fundamental Rights chapter, most were agreed to, but of course the most controversial and the most difficult is the one to do with 13th Amendment and the devolution. And I think that is where a lot of negotiations have to take place. This government has decided to ignore it. We won't have any devolution or anything. They were even thinking of removing the 13th Amendment. But Tamils have had a political history arguing and fighting for this. So it must be accommodated in some way that the majority will also be comfortable with.
I'd also like to speak to you about the importance of memorialization, which is a right. A Tamil mother who has lost her son in the conflict must be able to light a candle on his behalf. That's a right.
Yes, of course. This, bulldozing cemeteries prevent people from lighting candles, and this is just not necessary. It's just prevent people from mourning. It's not necessary. You don't need to do that. You can allow people to mourn. You can allow people to acknowledge, to memorialize their children. After all, and I think it also makes the state, people have a sense of more of a belongings, have a sense of a benign state if you allow them to do that. But if you keep crushing them at a very personal level, this is as personal as you can come to light a candle for your son,
Right.
Then, they will always see the state as alien and foreign and oppressive.
Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, "Transitional justice comprises the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abusers in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation." How may we envision a transformative society in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think what we have to do with regard to a transformative society is to go back to the imperative of democracy, of some measure of pluralism, and also to respect the dignity of individuals through fundamental rights and fundamental rights chapter. And at the most local level, to develop rituals and practices that are inclusive and diverse and tolerant at the most local level, you know. And again, we found in the last few days those practices were developing. People were having inclusive practices, were developing creative ways of being together, not only across religions but across class. Yeah. What was interesting is there was a very interesting and between police and protesters, etc. Before, of course, it got violent, and that was terrible. But at least we had those kinds of development of transformation at the local level. We have to have constitutional transformation, but we also have to have transformation at the community level. And of course, the media has a big role to play in promoting some of these ideas.
My final question to you, how must the education system of Sri Lanka be reformed to encompass history studies, for example, and bilingualism or trilingualism? How important is that for Sri Lanka to move forward?
I was on the Youth Commission in the 1990s, and we gave recommendations on education which I think are still very important. That was trilingualism. Right. Children learn very fast, you know. Yeah. And you know, as they grow older, they can learn. I think continue to focus, especially on the linked language, English, but also to have a working language of Tamil or Sinhala is very crucial. And I think that's something that's very important. And of course, education reforms is also to teach modern history. Most of the education, most of the history they teach ends with the last king, and there's about 5% devoted to the 20th century. But you know, we are a modern nation with so much that has happened in the 20th and 21st century. So children should be aware of that, not only of kings conquering, you know. So then people think that that's how a state should be run, a king conquering, you know. But they should have really a sense of democracy and what has gone by knowledge of history.
And finally, my last question. When we started the show, you said how people bond over common suffering. How do we go about bringing people together?
I think we have to get people to sit down and talk to each other. It's difficult. You know, when they when they brought the mothers of the disappeared in the north and the south together, everybody said they would bond immediately because the children were disappeared, but they didn't bond initially.
Okay.
Because they had their identity, you know, the Sinhala identity and the Tamil identity, and one had to work on it for some time for them to begin to bond. So it's something you have to work on and talk to, but the government must be committed to it. It can't just erase it. It's just erasure that is taking place at the moment about all these issues. And since non-recurrence is one of our main themes, we just, you know, don't want things to recur. We don't want that kind of unpleasantness.
How hopeful are you?
I'm very hopeful. I've met a lot of young people that have made me very hopeful over the last year or two.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next week. Good night.